Hello to our audience as well and to our subscribers. I am Dr. Michael Nevradakis. On behalf of Orthos Logos News, Greece's first and only constructive journalism outlet, I'm pleased to have the opportunity today to speak with Branko Milanovic. Dr. Milanovic is a visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, an affiliated senior scholar at the Luxembourg Income Study, is affiliated with the London School of Economics and the Barcelona Institute for International Studies. He was formerly the lead economist in the World Bank's research department, and he is the author of several books, including his most recent book, Capitalism Alone, the future of the system that rules the world. And to get us started, Dr. Milanovic, if we accept that inequality, which of course is one of your main areas of research, if we accept that inequality is the biggest challenge facing Western societies, posing a threat to existing democratic structures and spurring the rise of populist movements, we wanted to ask you, as an expert researcher in the field of economic inequality and as part of our investigation here at Orthos Logos into possible proposals and solutions that would address this issue of inequality, some questions regarding this issue. To start with, a recent report by Oxfam mentions the virus of inequality, which has been exacerbated during the pandemic. Oxfam spoke with almost 300 economists, from what I understand, some very well-known ones among them, and almost 90% of them predicted that one of the impacts of the pandemic will be an increase in income inequality. Is this a prediction that you agree with?
You know, this is the question I'm being asked quite a lot recently. I have to say it's difficult to say much now when the pandemic is still going on, and we are not only in the midst, but actually, I guess to some extent we are at the peak of the pandemic. Let me say why I have to be slightly more cautious than most people. If you look at inequality within countries, it is true that people with so-called essential jobs have been affected both health-wise more than the others, those who actually were able to work really from homes. And also they've been affected more in terms of income because either they lost jobs or their jobs became shorter, or they had actually to take something else. So that would seem to indicate that if you look at let's suppose more skilled, better paid jobs versus less skilled and less skilled jobs, that inequality went up. On the other hand, one has to take into account the enormous increase in the stimulus packages that the European countries and the United States gave. So we are talking here about unprecedented inflows of 20% of GDP. These are transfers of money. Obviously, as you know, this is like basically new money being created out of thin air. And quite a lot of that money went precisely either to companies or to people who were in a lower part or lower half of the income distribution. So there were some cases of people, and there actually might not have been so few of them, who had higher incomes than they would have had otherwise. So, the situation then becomes a little bit tricky. And as I said, because of such high amount of transfers, it is really difficult to judge very, how should I say, based on a few data points that we have. Finally, I have to say that, of course, it is also true that at the very top of the wealth distribution, because of the increase in the stock market and because of the success of some companies like Amazon and the others, we have had further accumulation of wealth. So there are really contradictory effects there. I would be very curious to see when eventually the results come out, how that income distribution chart, or actually what is called growth incidence curve, would look like for 2020. So I'm in agreement with them, but I have to be a little bit more cautious that it may not be as stark as some people say.
Now, that being said, inequality is an issue that has global impacts all across many different societies. But despite a prevalent and persistent negativity bias that also exists all around us, you open the news and all you hear, it seems, is bad news. And this was true even before the pandemic. Key indicators suggest that the world, in general terms, is in fact continuously improving. So, for example, according to the Gapminder Institute, indicators such as poverty and overall health and education, et cetera, show that the inequality between wealthy nations and poor nations is gradually declining. Could we then perhaps therefore say that the phenomenon of economic inequality is most stark, most evident within economically developed countries such as the US?
Yes, so far, actually, in the first question that you asked me, I spoke only about possible changes of inequality within countries, and I really spoke about the rich countries when you had that large stimulus packages rather. Obviously, I didn't speak of India, where I think the situation is much more bleak, simply because there was no such help. But now in the second question, you're asking a different, you're taking a different angle, and that angle is really inequality between nations, or rather actually inequality between all citizens in the world, which is of course largely determined also by inequality between nations. But it's not obviously equivalent, because nations like China or India have a huge impact on global inequality, whereas countries that are very small obviously have much less, simply because they have fewer people. So there, if you look, actually, you see poverty, of course, having declined in the last 30 years, but mostly thanks to China. So really, China was that engine of global poverty reduction that worked extremely hard. For example, China at the time of the reforms in 1978 had almost, well, exactly 98% of rural population below the absolute poverty line. This year, China's objective was to eliminate rural poverty. Now, whether it is now 0 or 2%, nobody knows. But in any case, the change from 98%, where it was about 800 million people or 900 million people in China, to almost 0, is obviously a huge result that basically drove the decline in global poverty. Then China also was a country that drove the decline in global inequality, because it was poor and then moved towards the middle class, to middle income status, and essentially moved lots of people into something that you can call the middle class, globally speaking. But that effect, I will not go into too many details because it gets a little bit complicated. I just want to say that China effect is now coming to a close, simply because China's income levels are sufficiently high that it does not really reduce that global inequality anymore. And it's creating gaps between itself that is out relatively high. China is like upper middle income country now, with countries like India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Sudan, that are also very large countries in terms of population. So the China effect is really at an end now in terms of global inequality, which then means that the next engine for us, for the world, should be India. So the growth rate of India, and also the high growth rate in Africa, if they can be achieved, would be the new China of the 21st century.
Very interesting. And in one of your books titled Global Inequality, a New Approach for the Age of Globalization, you have described how globalization developed over time, where it may be headed, and what we can do to perhaps go in a different direction. You spoke of a popular capitalism or a more equal capitalism. Could you explain these concepts and overall how you view the direction of globalization for us?
Yes, so the concepts that you mentioned are actually based on the following observation. When you historically looked at how distribution of capital and labor income was in capitalist countries. In the past, if you read, for example, Ricardo or Marx, you had the emphasis was on what is called today functional inequality. So in other words, it is inequality between capital and labor. The assumption was that everybody who had capital was actually rich, and these people had 100% of their income derived from property or from capital. And then workers, of course, were poorer. Some were poor, some were the middle class, but 100% of their income was derived from labor. Well, that has really changed in the course of development. We now have people at the top of the income distribution who draw quite significant amount of income, both from capital and labor. I will give you obvious examples. If you take, for example, people who work with at the top jobs as managers, or you take people who work in the startup companies, or you take doctors or medical profession in general, engineers and others. These are the people who very often have very high salaries, but also, be it through inheritance or more likely because they've been saving the money through their life because they had large salaries, they also draw quite a lot of income from capital. So this is something new. In the past, as I said, these two groups were really divided. These were not the same people who were capitalists and who were workers. I used the Greek neologism that I created with some help from Greek friends to call that homoplutia, in the sense that the same people are now wealthy in two types of income, labor and capital. But it still leads to the following problem, is that actually the share of your income that comes from capital is increasing as you become richer. So what I call the people's capitalism would be a capitalism where that would no longer be the case. In other words, where actually maybe your income would be 5 times higher than my income, but you would not have a higher share of capital in your income than I. So maybe you have, out of $10, you have, 7 in labor and 3 in capital. And maybe I have, to take another $20, 14 from labor and 6 from capital. In other words, our shares would be the same, even if our total incomes are different. Last point, why is it important that the shares be the same? Because if the share of capital increases thanks to automation and robotics, then our relative incomes would increase in the same rate. So there will be any automatic increase in inequality.
I see, very interesting. And perhaps related to this, and based on your own research, who have historically been the winners and the losers, so to speak, of globalization? And can this state of affairs perhaps change in the future?
Well, it's an interesting question. Historically, I actually try to look at my books, as you know, actually at the historical aspect as well. If you look at the first globalization, which was really driven by the Industrial Revolution in England and then increased income in Western Europe and then the United States, that globalization was linked also with colonialism, imperialism, and essentially European rule of the rest of the world. Now, the winners of that globalization were certainly people who ruled the world, not only because they had access to the cheaper raw materials and the cheap labor force, but also they were able, through the greater efficiency of their production, to essentially deindustrialize some countries like India. The famous example is that India was as much of a cloth producer as England was in the late 18th century. Well, that whole Indian production was wiped out by the English production because it was much more efficient, because England was using machinery which actually produced things more cheaply. So you had a deindustrialization of India. Well, something similar is now happening, but in the other direction, because with this current globalization ability that, as you know, you can actually produce far from your place, you can actually outsource, you can send your capital to a faraway country. What now we find out is that labor is much cheaper in certain countries, especially in Asia, and in Africa now with textiles, for example, and that you're able to produce things much more cheaply there. So now we have the reverse process of the industrialization of many Western countries. And partly that's behind the movements like Trump, because as we have seen, many people who felt they lost jobs or their their livelihood was threatened by imports or by outsourcing, voted for him. Maybe the same effects are behind things in England like Brexit, or maybe Gilets jaunes in France, and Le Pen also. They are from different angles. Le Pen may be the right wing, and Gilets jaunes were more I would say left wing. But this is lots of discontent, this unhappiness essentially with globalization. So there are, I think, similarities between the two episodes.
Now, in your recent book, Capitalism Alone, which recently circulated in Greece with a Greek language translation, you wrote, among other things, that the world is governed by one solitary economic system, the capitalist system. You warned about the dangers of capitalism morphing into what you called plutocratic capitalism. Tell us more about this danger as you see it and how you view the future of the capitalist system.
First, I would like to say that I'm very pleased that Capitalism Alone has been published in Greek. Global Inequality that you mentioned before also was published in Greek, so obviously it's a pleasure. I'm actually just regret the fact that because of the travel issues that we all now have, that I cannot be in Greece and do that in vivo, speak about the book, but hopefully that will be possible. Now, you mentioned plutocratic capitalism. One of the, I think, issues with inequality is that inequality seeps or invades, if you will, the political space. This is not something new. If you go and, I'm glad I'm speaking to a Greek audience, if you go and read, Aristotle or Plato, or things from the ancient Greece, this issue was present there as well as it was present in Rome. Essentially, the rich people always try to dominate the political space directly or indirectly by buying votes or by influencing the politicians who were there in power. So this is not a new phenomenon. Now, we have, of course, in the modern world, we have in principle the same right of vote for everybody. As you know, in Greek city-states, the right of vote was limited. Now it is actually to everybody above a certain age. But the reality, first, is that many people do not vote. And I would like to mention, because sometimes it's forgotten, how it shows a lack of really interest and belief in democracy, that in a country like the United States, you have elections generally with 50% participation. This election had 62%, despite the fact it was perceived such a make it or break it election that whether it would leave American democracy intact or destroyed. But still, despite 4 years of sort of political campaigns, you still were not able to bring 2/3 of the population to vote. So because it was less than 66%, as I said. So then, of course, the issue is that the rich people, in particular through funding of the campaigns, are able to influence the political decision-making and basically choose individuals who are going to implement policies they like. So I think this is a general problem. It is greater like in countries like the United States, where the campaign contributions are unlimited, than in Europe, where you have much more control over campaign contributions. However, I want to simply mention that many of the latest issues, like for example with Sarkozy, with Chirac before him, with Helmut Kohl, they were all related to campaign contributions. In other words, it is very difficult, and I think in Greece you know it quite well, it's very difficult to run political campaign nowadays with only legal sources of money. Simply the campaigns are way too expensive, and if you win, you have to actually take somewhat illegal or fully illegal sources of income, which then means that the rich people have an influence over you.
Now, could we perhaps imagine a capitalist system where the reproduction of inequality is interrupted, a more humanist capitalism of sorts, perhaps, or similarly, a better globalization as opposed to a worse globalization?
Let me try to answer the first question. There is lots of talk recently about modifying capitalism or making capitalism better. Now, I'm not dismissive of that talk, because I think that sometimes attempts to make things better are, lead to something better. For example, I think that if one were to work on inequality seriously, in other words, to reduce inequality seriously through taxation, regulation, increase in the minimum wage, education open to everybody, and top education, not like any education, you could actually make a change in inequality. However, where I'm more skeptical is changing the, how should I say, modus operandi of the value system of capitalism. I think, and I mentioned that in Capitalism Alone, one of the greater advantages of capitalism was that it was able to align the objectives of companies, which is basically profit making, with the objectives of individuals, because in our normal lives, we do value wealth acquisition. To take Deng Xiaoping, when he said, rich is being glorious, we do that actually in our ordinary lives all the time. Now, the problem is, this is actually very good for the development of capitalism. But the problem is that it's very difficult if you have such an alignment of the value system and the objectives of the companies to change that. Now, we have a talk about stakeholders rather than shareholders. I'm sympathetic to that idea, but I just find it very difficult that to implement in cases where you really have a real trade-off. If you have a trade-off, whether you want to satisfy customers or workers versus shareholders, what are you going to choose? And I think in most cases, you would choose shareholders. So in that sense, I'm a little bit skeptical that you could change that fundamental premise of capitalist societies, which is, of course, making a profit and expansion, as Marx was saying, as permanent expansion towards new areas of production.
And yet, nevertheless, to my understanding at least, this so-called stakeholder capitalism seems to be a main plank of the so-called Great Reset. Many people are talking about it recently, just as they are talking about the beginning really of the fourth industrial revolution. Many things are being heard about what all of this is going to mean for all of us in the future. So is this Great Reset this big scary thing that we should be worried about and feel all this uncertainty about? Or is it something better? Is it something that's even feasible in terms of a change in economic system?
I think when it comes to the so-called reset, of course, we have not seen much of it, but so we have to be a little bit careful. There may be lots of words, but less in reality. I think there are two different parts. One is, if you will, how should I say, infrastructure part, in the sense, not infrastructure in terms of buildings, but infrastructure in terms of fundamental of the economic system. There, people talk about robotics, artificial intelligence, and essentially capital with machines, which means robots, replacing labor. Now, that's something which might happen, and it's actually happening already now. But I'm not particularly worried about that, because this is a process that has been lasting 200 years. Every time that we had that, if you just go back to David Ricardo writing about machinery, we had same fears of that. And every time, of course, there were some groups of people who were affected and who lost jobs or lost income, but there were many new jobs that have been created, and somebody of my age remembers quite well that most of the lots of jobs that exist now that came with the internet, with the transformation of, introduction of computers in our ordinary lives, they simply didn't exist, 20 or 25 years ago. So the technology destroys some jobs, but creates even more new jobs. So this is something I'm not, I don't think that we should be overly worried as a society. We may be worried as individuals if we just happen to be what is called routine occupations that are being replaced. Now, the second issue of the reset is the attempt to make, that was basically the previous question, attempt to make capitalism more, humane. You can call it capitalism with human face. And so on that, as I said, I'm sympathetic. It goes together also with green economy. But as I said before, I'm somewhat skeptical that it could be doable on a larger scale, because it would really contradict some of the essential tenets of capitalist society. And for that reason, I don't see it coming.
So could we perhaps, and could you envision a entirely different and perhaps better economic system that could feasibly exist in the future to replace what we have now, what we're used to?
You know, people have been writing about that. For example, in Piketty's latest book, there are, you know, at the end of the book, there's, you know, number of proposals. They're fairly radical because they would limit, for example, the ability of capital owners to make decisions in their companies. For example, even if you have 80% of shares in your company, you would only have 10% of the votes. So essentially, you would be limited in your ability to exercise a managerial role. So that would clearly make capitalism look different. I'm not sure that this is politically feasible, but it certainly would make capitalism different. A greater role in management of workers would do the same. I had in my book, which is, I don't think it is not original because other people have also proposed that, is that workers be given, not given, or either given or that it would be make much more easier for them to buy shares. So, and also that there would be advantages for small investors to buy shares. So in other words, to distribute the ownership of capital, what I call to deconcentrate capital ownership. Mm-hmm. So that would also change capitalism to some extent. So there are different proposals. Some of them are somewhat utopian because they go a little bit like they look like a little bit like proposals from the 19th century. You know, people who have studied Marxian economics know, of course, of Fourier, Proudhon, and others. They were proposals that would actually would not be put into reality, into action, and they were actually sometimes meant like small communal properties, or they actually would not have a great influence on the normal run of things. So that can be done as well. I think that actually in the future, but it's probably long-term future, we could see the situation where capital becomes abundant and labor becomes a scarce factor of production. I think under these conditions, the situation would change and it would look a little bit like the startups look today, in the sense that you would have people, which means workers, who would have an idea and they would easily borrow capital. So the management role in that case would really belong to labor. And that would be, I think, big change.
Now, we started this discussion talking about inequality. Let's come back to that and merge it, if you will, with the discussion of various economic proposals. A lot has been said recently, even before the pandemic, about the idea of a universal basic income. It's been trialed in various parts of the world. How do you evaluate UBI as a potential remedy for inequality?
Yeah, in Capitalism Alone, I was rather skeptical about UBI, and I put down several reasons, including the fact that it cannot simply run if you have a welfare state, and most of Western countries are de facto welfare state of, you know, some bigger, some smaller, but they all have the same instruments: unemployment benefits, pension, pay-as-you-go, generally pensions, then occupational pensions, then social assistance for those who really fall between the cracks. So you cannot obviously have that system plus UBI running in parallel. So you would have actually also a change in the ideology of the system. The system of welfare state was based on the insurance ideology. So you get insured for whatever happens in your life at the time where you cannot really contribute and work. You lose your job, you're insured. You become old, you're actually insured against lack of income in the old age. You become pregnant, you're insured about lack of income because you cannot work. So this is the principle. The UBI has an entirely different principle, which is the principle of basically residency or citizenship. So everybody has an access. I was not, as I said, I was not sure that these two, I'm actually quite sure they cannot run together. I also believe that the UBI has the problem of potentially leading to maybe 15 or 20% of population really not working simply because they would be happy with that minimal income. Then there is also a further issue, is that left-wing people actually are in favor of UBI because they believe that it can be set at a relatively high level and the taxation can come from the rich people. But the rich people are also, or the right wing rather, are also in favor of UBI for the opposite reason, because they say, and the US is very clear, we will give you an UBI, something, and never come back and complain about high inequality again, because you have enough income. So these are all, in my opinion, disadvantages of UBI, and I have not changed my opinion on that. But I have to admit that given the pandemic, it is true that if we had a UBI, it would have made things much simpler, because UBI would be an automatic stabilizer, in the sense that when you have such a tremendous development like a pandemic, everybody would be guaranteed a certain income, and it actually would work smoothly. You would not have to have negotiations between parties. You would not have to have legislative decisions in order to distribute the money. So, you know, I admit actually in conditions of extreme duress, or, you know, conditions like pandemic, possibly war, some other, you know, natural catastrophes, UBI is certainly a good instrument. So in that sense, I've actually modified my skepticism from the book after the pandemic.
Now, looking ahead to the future, the United Nations has put forward a series of 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, to be achieved by 2030, and they target such issues as inequality. Are these goals attainable in your view, and also are they sufficient?
You know, I was always, I was wondering about the goal of inequality, because inequality is a fairly amorphous topic. You know, inequality has to be defined. Are we talking inequality of income or wealth? Are we talking about individual inequality or household or family inequality? Are we talking about inequality within a country or between the countries? So there are many of these things. You know, poverty, when we talk about poverty, is actually clearer to define, because you have simply a poverty line. Not everybody might agree on that poverty line, but once you have agreed on something which is reasonable, you just count the number of people who are below that line. It's a very clear objective. Inequality is not as clear an objective, although I think, as I said, some inequalities are clearer than the others. For example, when it comes to gender inequality, you could actually, or racial, you could actually calculate, you know, that, and you can see what is the gap in wages between, for the same, you know, education experience between women and men, and your objective could be reduction of that. So I'm actually in favor of some targeting some types of inequalities, but I'm a little bit less in favor of targeting inequality in this general broad sense. We cannot say what is the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality that should apply to the United States, the way that it applies to Zambia or to China or to Korea. So, you know, it is not one number that we can actually put and say this is kind of an objective that is, you know, valid for everybody.
Now, you have previously worked with the World Bank. You were their lead economist in their research department. What can you tell us, especially based on your experience, about the role that these global organizations play today in terms of global governance, and the role that they can play in the future in tackling these major global issues?
You know, historically, just to speak of the World Bank, and maybe I will say a few words about the IMF later. The World Bank has played an important role because it was really a provider of cheap capital, because they would borrow at relatively low rates because their loans were guaranteed. They would provide relatively cheap loans to developing countries. You know, in the beginning, of course, it started with Europe. You know, it started as part of the Marshall Plan. So that was the history of the World Bank. But the World Bank became much less important player as private capital flows became so much greater from the late 70s, early 80s. So the World Bank's role changed. It also changed in sort of moving more toward structural adjustment, which is basically money given to governments with conditions, but not for specific projects. And then eventually, like when I was in the research department, the World Bank's role became more of an agency that would, how should I say, promote certain policies. Some of these policies, or most of the policies, were actually neoliberal policies, and they continue to be neoliberal policies. But the World Bank is also in a good position to collect information, to disseminate information. And in that sense, I think it does have a role to play in the future, because despite the fact that we have so much, so many different outfits that produce information, the place where the information comes from the government sources, and with the access to government sources that the World Bank does have, provides the bank with a still unique opportunity. And I know that when working from household surveys for all individual countries, unique opportunity to be really somebody with ability to provide knowledge and information across the countries. So I think this would be the new role, and that role would not be as much on policy side, because I think that neoliberal policies got pretty how should I say, they're not very popular anymore. Nor would it be its role at the level of lending, although there is still obviously significant amounts of lending, but compared to the private flows, they are relatively small. So I would say that the role of the World Bank and international organizations will continue to be an important role, but not at the same extent that it used to be in the past. That applies a little bit less to the IMF, because the IMF had always, and of course it had in the European crisis and Greek crisis, had a very important role, because their role was really had to do with balance of payment in general, and with crisis. Essentially, as you know, the IMF is the ultimate anti-cyclical organization. When there are no crises, the IMF has absolutely nothing to do. But when there is a crisis, they are actually extremely busy.
Now, looking at the world today with the pandemic still ongoing, of course, do you believe that the pandemic could end up serving as a game changer as far as international cooperation is concerned through issues such as vaccine distribution, for example? And could this cooperation and expand outward to other types of cooperation?
I think that the pandemic would serve as an accelerator to some technological developments, like the one that we are witnessing now, is the ability, for example, to work away from your physical work post. That I think has been accelerated because obviously technologically we could do that before, but we were very sort of cautious or maybe shy of doing it. It was not done on a large scale. And suddenly we were pushed in the direction that we actually had to do it. And we realized that you could do certain things, including, for example, teaching. That was done even before, but in a very small measure. So I think it has accelerated these changes. And I think it would make the labor force, globally labor force, basically mimic the labor force that would exist with free circulation of labor. Because you could hire actually for some jobs people far away from you, pay them much less, and that would be very similar as if these people were to live, for example, in that rich country. So that would have that effect. Now, for the collaboration, I'm not so sure, because we have not seen that much of collaboration when it comes to the vaccines so far. Rather, we have seen actually lack of collaboration, as you know, even within Europe, between the UK and the European Union, the relations are bad when it comes to the vaccine distribution, and the companies that were supposed to produce vaccine for the UK or for the European Union. There is lots of problems within the European Union itself. So we have not seen much of that. We have not even seen much from the rich countries distributing vaccines to the less developed countries. Actually, it was China that has done much more work on that or contribution on that than the US, for example. Rather, I would say we have seen an increased vaccine nationalism than cooperation. Now, I believe that once the rich countries have vaccinated most of their population, they do have a very strong incentive to vaccinate the others, because you cannot control this pandemic until every country has controlled it. So we might have some more cooperation down the road. But currently we see much more of nationalism when it comes to vaccines.
Now, as we prepare to wrap up, final set of short questions. Where do you see the world post-pandemic, post-Biden, now that we have a new presidency in the US, and at the end of the decade in 2030, which is the year that the UN SDGs are supposed to be met?
Well, I should answer this quickly, because the quicker the answer, the less inaccurate it could be. I see the world as increasingly China and the US. I think that Trump's turn against China is not an accident. Actually, the political space in the US has become much more anti-Chinese. When I say space, I mean like politicians in both parties. So that's, I think, would be a bad development. And I see, on the other hand, globalization continuing for the reasons that I mentioned before, with globalization of labor. But I also see the greater role of the state, because it was revealed by this pandemic that in countries that really believe that they can run the health system like they run hotels, it has really been shown that this is not the right way to do it. And that, you know, as you know, many people have actually even died simply because of the lack of facilities, lack of oxygen that we see now in Brazil and elsewhere. And that was essentially done because of austerity policies and because of the belief that you can actually, you can not have redundancies in things like health. And last point, you know, I always quote, that was Nassim Taleb's example, why do we have two pilots on a plane? You know, for short distances, well, I suppose within Europe, you never need two pilots, but you have a redundancy because the cost of something happening to a pilot is huge. The same is true for the health system. So you cannot run it based on sort of minimization of the cost.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Milanovic, thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your insights with us and with the audience that we have here at Orthos Logos. And I think we're all looking forward to, hopefully, things getting better all around. So thank you once again for sharing your insights and thoughts with us.